I used to think love was enough, that if two people cared about each other deeply, they could get through anything. But life has a cruel way of proving you wrong. It started with something small. A misunderstanding, a careless comment, a shift in energy so subtle that at first I convinced myself I was imagining it. But deep down, I knew better. Love doesn't just vanish overnight. It erodes, slowly, piece by piece, until one day you wake up and realize the person lying next to you feels like a stranger. Luke and I had been together for 6 years, married for 3. He was the kind of man you build a life with, stable, loyal, and unwavering in his love. I was the restless one, always needing reassurance, craving validation in ways that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was insecurity, maybe just a need to feel desired. Either way, I knew my flaws. And yet, knowing them didn't stop me from making the biggest mistake of my life. It had been a rough few months. Luke had been distant, work had consumed him, and our conversations had turned into nothing more than exchanges of necessities. "What do you want for dinner? Did you take out the trash?" I missed him, and yet every time I tried to reach out, it felt like I was grasping at air. Then came the night that changed everything. Jenna, my best friend since college, invited me out for drinks. "You need a break," she insisted. "Let loose a little." And for once, I agreed. I told myself I just needed to clear my head, step away from the suffocating silence of our home, and maybe when I got back, I'd find a way to fix things with Luke. I never expected him to be there, the man who would set everything into motion. He wasn't particularly handsome, but he had a confidence about him that made people take notice. He slid onto the bar stool next to me, and before I even realized what was happening, we were talking. It was innocent at first, just conversation. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't in months, made me feel seen in a way I had forgotten was possible. I told myself it was harmless, that I just needed a moment to feel something again. But deep down, I knew I was playing with fire. When he leaned in and whispered, "Let's step outside, it's too loud in here," I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. The cold night air should have sobered me up, should have reminded me of what I had to lose. Instead, it made everything feel more intense, more electrifying. And then it happened. A kiss. Clumsy, reckless, and over in an instant. But that instant was all it took. Because when I pulled away, heart racing, stomach in knots, I saw him. Luke, sitting in his car watching me. And in that moment, I knew I had destroyed everything. His face was unreadable, but the weight of his stare felt heavier than any words he could have spoken. He didn't get out of the car, didn't yell or demand answers. He just sat there, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The disappointment in his eyes was worse than any anger he could have shown me. Panic surged through my veins. My breath hitched as I took a step toward him, my body moving on instinct. "Luke," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. But he didn't react. He simply rolled up the window, put the car in reverse, and drove away without looking back. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the parking lot, my stomach churning with a sickening mixture of guilt and fear. The man from the bar shifted awkwardly beside me, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know him?" he asked, already sensing the answer. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "That was my husband." His eyes widened, and he immediately took a step back. "Shit," he muttered. I had no idea. If I had known, "Just go," I cut him off. I couldn't deal with his guilt on top of my own. He hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'm sorry," he murmured before disappearing back inside. But his apology meant nothing. The damage was already done. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Luke's number. It rang and rang and rang until it went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, nothing. By the time I got home, his car was gone. The house was dark, empty. It felt colder than it ever had before. I paced the living room, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Maybe he just needed time to cool off. Maybe he'd come back and we'd talk, and I could somehow explain. Though what was there to explain? I had kissed another man. I had betrayed him. I barely slept that night, every minute stretching into an eternity. My phone remained silent, and with every passing hour, the weight in my chest grew heavier. Morning came, and with it, a sick sense of dread. When I walked into the kitchen, there he was, sitting at the table. His face was unreadable, his expression carefully guarded, but it was his silence that terrified me the most. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine with a coldness that sent a chill down my spine. "We need to talk." And I knew then, this wasn't something I could fix with an apology. This was the beginning of the end. Jenna didn't sugarcoat it. "Emily, you should have been more careful," she said, her voice low so the other girls wouldn't hear. "You know Luke's sensitive. Guy stuff like that, especially coming from you, sticks with him. You need to fix this before it's too late." I nodded, but her words only added to the weight on my chest. I knew she was right. But how do you fix something when the other person has already started pulling away? The silence was the worst part. He didn't scream, didn't argue, didn't say a single word that could be translated into an accusation directed at me. He just existed. And in a way, that stung worse than if he'd exploded. It was as if we had come to some silent, unspoken agreement that I wasn't worth the effort of a fight. That realization crushed me. I started overthinking every little thing. If I laughed at a TV show, I'd glance at him to see if he was annoyed. If I asked about his day and got a one-word answer, I'd wonder if I had pushed too hard. I felt like I was walking on eggshells in my own home, constantly trying to prove to him, and maybe to myself, that I was still the person he had fallen in love with. One night, I tried again to clear the air. "Luke," I started cautiously. "About the other night, I'm really sorry, but..." Before I could finish, he cut me off. "Emily, I've heard your apologies. I just need time, okay?" His tone wasn't harsh, but it was final. I nodded and dropped it, but inside I felt like I was losing him more with every passing day. I kept telling myself to be patient, that he'd come around eventually, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something had shifted between us, and I didn't know if it could ever go back to the way it was. By Friday night, I just couldn't handle the silence anymore. Luke had barely spoken to me all week, and when he did, it was as if every word took effort. The house felt suffocating. I knew I was the reason for all of it, but I didn't know how to fix it. So instead of staying home and facing the mess I had created, I decided to go out. I told myself I just needed a breather, a night to clear my head, but deep down, I knew I was running away. I texted Jenna to meet me at the bar, but she had plans with her husband. Figures, right? Everyone seemed to have it together except me. I went alone. At first, I told myself it wasn't a big deal, just a drink or two, and then I'd head home. But once I got there, the loneliness hit me like a brick wall. The couples laughing, the groups of friends clinking glasses, it all made me feel so small. That's when he showed up. I didn't notice him at first, but he slid onto the bar stool next to me and said, "You look like you've had a long day." I turned to look at him, caught off guard by the easy confidence in his voice. He wasn't overly handsome, but he carried himself like someone who knew how to hold a conversation. His dark eyes were warm, and his smile was the kind that made you feel like the only person in the room. I should have ignored him. I should have excused myself, walked away, called Jenna, done anything besides what I actually did. Instead, I smiled back. "Yeah, something like that," I said, swirling the drink in my hand. He raised an eyebrow. "Rough week?" I let out a small laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Something like that," I repeated. He didn't press, just nodded and took a sip of his drink. We fell into easy conversation, something light and effortless. He asked about my job, laughed at my stupid jokes, told me I had the prettiest smile he'd seen all night. It was such a stark contrast to the cold silence I had been living with at home. I knew I shouldn't have been entertaining it, but for the first time in weeks, I felt seen. The drinks kept coming. I lost track of how many I had, but I wasn't drunk, just comfortable, just loose enough to let my guard down. At one point, he leaned in closer and asked, "Do you want to step outside? It's getting loud in here." I hesitated. I told myself it was harmless. We were just going to talk outside. That was all. So I nodded. The cool night air hit me like a wake-up call, but it wasn't enough to stop what happened next. We stood by his car, still talking, still laughing, and he said something about how he couldn't believe someone like me was out alone. A beautiful woman like you, sitting at a bar by herself? Either something's really wrong, or the men in your life are complete idiots. I don't even know what came over me. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was the validation I had been craving, or maybe I was just too weak to walk away. Before I knew it, I was leaning in. And so was he. The kiss wasn't passionate or romantic, it was clumsy, fueled by a mix of bad decisions and loneliness. But in that moment, it felt like everything I had been missing. Attention, validation, a break from the crushing weight of guilt I carried. It felt wrong, but I didn't stop. Then the sound of a car pulling up shattered the moment. I pulled away, laughing nervously, and turned to see who it was. And then I saw him. Luke. Sitting in his car, watching us. My heart stopped. He didn't get out, didn't yell, didn't do anything dramatic. He just sat there, staring at me, with a look on his face I'll never forget. Disappointed, almost disgusted. Like he didn't even recognize me anymore. The guy from the bar followed my gaze. "Do you know him?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "That's my husband." His face immediately dropped. He took a step back. "I didn't know you were married. I wouldn't have." But I wasn't listening. My focus was on Luke. I took a step forward. "Luke, wait," I called out, but he didn't say a word. He just rolled up the window and drove away, leaving me standing there in the middle of the parking lot, like an idiot. I stood frozen in the parking lot, my heart hammering in my chest as Luke's taillights disappeared into the night. The sickening realization of what I had just done settled in my stomach like a lead weight. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone, barely able to tap his name in my contacts. Voicemail. I called again, and again, and again. Nothing. I felt a presence beside me, the guy from the bar shifting uncomfortably. "Look, I didn't know you were married. I wouldn't have." I cut him off with a sharp shake of my head. "Just go." He hesitated for a second, then nodded and slipped back inside the bar without another word. And just like that, I was alone. I stumbled to my car, gripping the door handle for support as my entire body shook. My reflection in the window was unrecognizable. Flushed cheeks, glassy eyes, lips that still tingled from a kiss that never should have happened. What had I done? I climbed into the driver's seat, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I tried calling Luke again, praying he'd pick up. Nothing. Tears blurred my vision as I threw my phone onto the passenger seat and gripped the steering wheel, struggling to steady myself. My mind raced with every possible scenario. Would he go home? Would he pack his bags? Would he even want to see me again? I had to get to him. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The drive home felt like an eternity, my stomach twisting with every mile. When I finally pulled into our driveway, my heart sank. Luke's car was gone. The house was dark, silent. I ran to the front door, fumbling with my keys. The second I stepped inside, I knew he wasn't here. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I rushed to our bedroom, hoping, praying, to see his duffel bag still in the closet, his clothes still hanging, some sign that he wasn't leaving me. But his side of the closet was half empty. His favorite hoodie, the one he always wore around the house, was gone. I let out a strangled sob, pressing my hand against my mouth to muffle the sound. No. I grabbed my phone and called him again. Straight to voicemail. I sent a text. "Emma, Luke, please come home. Please, I messed up, I know, but we need to talk. Just tell me where you are." The message sat there, delivered but unread. I paced the living room, my mind spinning. What if he was at a hotel? Or worse, what if he was already meeting with a lawyer? The thought made me feel like I was going to be sick. I curled up on the couch, clutching my phone, waiting, hoping for some sign that he'd give me a chance to explain. But the hours passed, and my phone remained silent. At some point, exhaustion won over panic, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The sound of the front door opening jolted me awake. My eyes snapped open, my heart leaping in my chest.